What's the most heartbreaking question a foster child has asked you? My foster kids thought plants grew from dead bodies, and watching them discover the truth changed everything. I was working as a research botanist when my partner Indigo, who works for Child Protective Services, came home with the worst case they'd ever encountered. Two siblings, ages 7 and 9, had been held captive in an underground bunker by extreme survivalist relatives who convinced them the surface world was contaminated and that all plant life was deadly poison. When authorities found them, they were so terrified of anything green that they screamed at the sight of grass and refused to eat vegetables because they believed all plants were toxic. The foster system was completely overwhelmed, and nobody wanted to take two children who had panic attacks at grocery stores and couldn't walk barefoot on lawns without having meltdowns. The little boy, Owen, would vomit if he saw soil, while his sister Nora would scratch her arms bloody if anyone mentioned flowers or trees. Indigo came home that night looking exhausted and said, "I know this sounds overwhelming, but what if we fostered them? You understand plants better than anyone, and maybe that's exactly what these kids need." The next morning, we called the agency and started the emergency placement process. For weeks after bringing them home, they lived in constant terror of our houseplants and begged us to throw away every piece of produce in our kitchen. They would only eat processed foods because they couldn't bear the thought that fresh fruits and vegetables had grown from contaminated soil. Owen hadn't spoken more than whispers since his rescue, and Nora would have nightmares about being buried alive in dirt every night. Simple things like walking past flower beds would send them into panic attacks, and they refused to go outside when anything was blooming. But slowly, very slowly, things began to change. Nora started eating packaged crackers that had vegetable ingredients when I showed her the words on the label. Owen began drinking orange juice when I explained it came from fruit trees that farmers took care of safely. They both started to trust that our small indoor herb garden wasn't going to harm them, even though they still wouldn't get within 3 feet of the pots. We thought we were making incredible progress until I started preparing our backyard garden for planting season. That's when I discovered both children watching me through the window with absolute terror written across their faces, backing away from the glass like I was about to commit murder. When I gently asked what was wrong, Nora whispered that the bad people always told them spring was when the poison in the ground got stronger, and that's when people who touched plants would get sick and die. I realized these kids had never experienced the miracle of growth, the joy of nurturing life, or watching something beautiful emerge from the earth. Instead, their survivalist captors had weaponized nature's most beautiful processes, telling them that every flower was proof the earth was contaminated, that gardens were toxic waste sites rather than sources of life. When I carefully explained that plants actually create oxygen for us to breathe, that vegetables give us nutrients to grow strong, and that flowers exist purely to bring beauty into the world, Nora stared at me like I was speaking an alien language. Owen looked at the soil in my hands and whispered something that broke my heart. "Will touching dirt make me sick and die? The bad people said children who touch the earth get poisoned just like everything else up here." I knelt down to his level and said gently, "Owen, the dirt won't hurt you. In fact, it's what helps beautiful things grow." He shook his head and backed away, still too terrified to believe me. I put the soil down and promised him we wouldn't do any gardening until he felt ready. But that night, after both kids were asleep, Indigo and I realized we needed to find a way to prove that plants meant life, not death. We decided to create the most magical garden experience imaginable, complete with fairy lights, painted rocks, and every child-friendly plant we could think of. But what happened the next morning destroyed me in the most beautiful way possible. When the kids saw our garden setup, they were curious, but still scared. I sat down in the dirt myself and planted a single sunflower seed, talking them through every step and explaining how it would grow into something beautiful. After an hour of gentle encouragement, Nora finally touched a seed, then carefully placed it in the soil. Owen watched her and slowly reached out to plant his own. 3 days later, I woke up to Nora shaking me awake, tears streaming down her face, pointing to the tiny green sprout that had emerged from the seed she'd planted. Owen was kneeling beside his own sprouting seed, both hands buried in soil, laughing for the first time since we'd known him. Nora stared at the little green shoot in amazement and whispered, "It's really alive. I made something alive." Owen looked up at me with dirt smeared across his cheek, grinning wider than I'd ever seen, and said simply, "Can we plant more tomorrow?"